fact, for my generation, though, I was the gardener. I started gardening when I was about 5, as she said, and by the time I was 8, my grandfather, who had 3 acres, had said, well, that acre over there is yours, whatever you grow on that, that's your money. And so at his instructions, I grew potatoes, popcorn, and pumpkins. And I sold the potatoes, 100-pound lots, 100-pound weights to the local grocery store. And I got to tell you that walking into the grocery store and seeing my potatoes in the produce section, it was just like, oh my God, this is so amazing. The bags of popcorn were sold, I think, for 50 cents a piece for a 1-pound pack of popcorn. And I don't remember what we sold the pumpkins for. For some reason, I seem to have an uncanny knack for being a good gardener. And I spent many hours with my mother's father, my grandfather, who taught me really how to garden. And I became infatuated with seeds. I really had a difficulty as a child getting along with people. For some reason, I was very headstrong, but I was always at home in the garden, and the plants and I seemed to get along just fine. So for many years, I was a good gardener without knowing how to garden. In other words, I just did it intuitively. By the time I became gardening as an adult, the art of seed saving had pretty well gone on. My grandfather saved seeds, but he didn't teach me how to save seeds. When I started gardening as an adult, I simply bought my seeds. And that was a change because my grandfather saved his seeds, right? He didn't order seeds unless he had a crop failure and he had to order something in. So in his house, there was always all these seed catalogs. And I brought a few of them out here, just because they made me feel good. But if you wanted to go through some of these and see some of the diversity that's available with some of these companies, Landman Seed Company supposedly is the oldest seed company in the United States, named Seed Search out of Arizona, Territorial. And then the one catalog I don't have here that I wish I had was Seed Savers Exchange. But I do have their yearbook. This is all seeds that are saved by individuals. It's very interesting because I didn't learn how to save seeds. I do know one gardener that's a friend of mine who's quite a bit younger than I, and she was taught by her mother to save seeds. And I think that's a part of their North American indigenous culture. But for most of us, seed saving is not done. We just don't learn about it. I grew up in a small town in Kansas. It's called Sabetha. There's a long story about why it's called Sabetha. But anyway, on 9th Street, just down from Main Street in Sabetha, Kansas, was the Sabetha Seed Company. And that was a local seed company. What happened originally is that people saved their own seeds. Clear back in time, about 12,000 years ago, when humans began to change from being a hunter-gatherer society, they had what they called the Neolithic Revolution, or the agriculture revolution, where people began to settle in and began to domesticate seeds. It's very interesting that we can tell exactly when they began to domesticate seeds because the seeds changed, the plants changed almost instantly within 100 to 200 years. I'm sorry, within 20 to 200 years. They change and they begin to shatter all at once rather than shattering at different times. Shattering at different times, if you're not being cultivated, is a good strategy for survival. Whereas if you're being cared for by humans, as Michael Pullen pointed out in the Botany Desire, right? The plants changed for us, and that way we propagated the plants. So when in the Fertile Crescent of with what we call Iraq, when they began to domesticate the wheats and the barleys, the change is dramatic. And so they can see the seeds, see the plants in the archaeological digs, and discover which ones were domesticated, which ones were not, and they can date these rather accurately. So everybody was saving their own seeds. Finally, about the 1700s, they began to have seed catalogs where people were sending the seeds out. And usually these were local businesses. Landreth says they're one of the oldest seed companies in the United States, but their initial business was not over the United States. It was in the general area of Pennsylvania. And they were probably giving a lot in the seeds of the Amish and the other non-English people of Pennsylvania, because that's what the Amish and What's the word I wanted?
Mennonites?
Mennonites, yes, Mennonites. That was some of the, and those people had their own seeds. And so Landgraf was probably doing a lot of business with them, using their seeds, selling them out to the general population around Pennsylvania. In Sabetha, we had the Sabetha Seed Company. That was selling to around Sabetha, Kansas, southern Nebraska, maybe even eastern Missouri. But then these began to be absorbed by larger corporations. Corporations that were selling their seeds over the entire nation. As a kid, not only we had the Sabetha Seed House, but we also had the Burpee catalog. You know, and in Kansas, this is a long time and you can't garden. You know, you're stuck inside, there's snow in the ground, it's freezing. And I would be at my grandfather's house reading the Burpee catalog. You know, just going through, and I made these lists, these long involved lists. Like, Grandpa, we had to go this one because this one's got da-da-da-da-da-da. And on down the line. Of course, he said, oh, yeah. He didn't order a single one. So, while we had, it's very interesting that agriculture began in several areas around the world, and it began without being tied to each other. So, about 12,000 years ago, you've got the agricultural revolution taking place in Iraq, the Fertile Crescent. And then shortly thereafter, in northern China, it takes place, and then in southern China, in India, and then in Mesoamerica, and also in South America. You have these, it seems like almost spontaneously, people began to cultivate plants. They began to stop being hunter-gatherers and start coalescing into cities, into towns. They were producing more food, so then there could be more specialized labor. The last conversion occurred in Northeast America about 6,000 years ago. So when they carbon date these sites, they're able to tell pretty close to how old these things are. So when humans were selecting the seeds and creating these improved crops, these improvements were passed from generation to generation, with each generation having the opportunity to improve on what I went on before. Thousands of years, families carried their own seeds forward by generations, and migrated humans would package their seeds, and that would be most important to them. They would go through they would go through many deprivations to make sure that their seeds weren't damaged. In fact, there's this book, I've just finished reading this book, and I found it quite profound. It's called The Unlikely Peace at Chucamaquik by Martin Pertell. Describes a situation where there was a huge earthquake in the 80s in Guatemala. And this family, this tribe, was not being supplied with any food, and they were out of food. But they refused to eat their seeds, because at some point they knew something would change, and somebody would come in, somehow they would find a way, and they would survive. And if they survived, they had to have these seeds to reestablish their crops. Many of the crops were staple crops. The thing of it is that all of our cultures at one time had this dependence on seed, had this attachment to seed. And as these seed companies grew and became larger, we lost that connection. And at some point by the 1930s, we pretty much began to abdicate our control of the seeds. We allowed somebody else to save the seeds for us, and we simply bought them. The problem becomes is that they did not have these seeds they did not have our interests at heart. The companies originally were just supplying seeds to people that had a bad harvest, or seeds to somebody who wanted to try something different or something new. But then, by the 30s, corn was really being sold every year because they were hybridizing corn. I'll get into what hybridization means in a second. But they were hybridizing corn. By hybridizing corn, those farmers had to buy corn new each year. It's a great business model if you're a seed company. It's not so great model if you're a farmer. So, as these seeds companies began to get larger and began to cover more ground, they do develop into wanting to sell things that you can't reproduce. For instance, if I sell you a seed that is what we call open pollinated, then you can plant that seed next year and you'll get pretty much the same fruit. But if I sell you a seed that's a hybrid, then it won't bear true. And as a consequence, you have to come back to me and buy the seeds again. It's a good business model. But let's talk about hybrids and open pollinated, just clear up a few things. Open pollinated oftentimes is abbreviated OP. Open pollinated seeds. An open pollinated plant is a set of a plant that we think of as a stable hybrid. However, it's not necessarily true. Open pollinated simply means you're not controlling the pollination. So open pollinated is strictly letting things pollinate themselves. As you'll see, we don't always open pollinate. Hybrids, used as it's used today, the term hybrid, we like to say that printers, the reason God, or my handwriting is the reason God gave us printers. Hybrids, usually what we talk about as a hybrid today is F1 generation, or the first filial generation. And that means it's the first progeny of a new cross. This cross, because it's the first generation of the cross, is unstable. If I buy a big boy tomato, and I eat the big boy tomato and save the seeds from the big boy tomato, if I plant those seeds, I will not get big boys. I might get some plants with big boys, but I'll get other plants with other things. In fact, we did this with a hybrid called orange sun gold tomatoes. Are you familiar with the orange sun gold?
Yeah.
It's about this big, and it's like each bite is a burst of sugar. It's not that I don't like them. You can get out next to the bush out in the garden and just sit there. Okay? You know. In fact, I think cherry tomatoes were invented to feed the gardener because if you try to cut them with a knife or get a fork in them, they end up in somebody else's eye. And that's not good. So they're really designed to be gardener food. You know, you pick wood as you work in the garden. We planted those out. We planted out the F1 seeds, and we ended up with 3 tomatoes. We got a little what do they call them? Currant tomato, which looked very much like an orange sun gold and tasted very much like a sun gold. And we got one that was about this big, which was kind of rose colored, kind of a light red. It was also pretty good. In fact, my mouth is beginning to water at this point. And then we got kind of an insipid red tomato. And so what we're doing now is we've taken the red one, which we're calling rose tomato, and the little itty bitty one, which we're calling D-mato, because the woman who's doing it, her name is D, so it's the D-mato. Anyway, so over time we'll make that into a stable cross, but right now it is an F1. Open pollinateds, in many cases, can be made, open pollinateds, in the case of tomatoes, beans, peas, and a few other crops, are super easy because they self-pollinate. They have male and female flowers, with male and female parts in the flowers. That's a flower. And so they cross together before the flower even opens. So obviously, if you have a seed from a tomato, if you have a tomato plant, you can save seed from that with no problem. So now we have these seed companies being bought up by other seed companies, and so you have fewer seed companies. In addition to that, you have fewer offerings in each individual seed company because they're offering F1s. They don't have to offer all the wonderful seeds that came before. Do we have the handout back there?
Yes, we do.
Let's make that handout available because I like this handout a great deal because it starts in 1903. And in 1903, look at the picture on the back. In 1903 was about when my grandfather was born. Let's take cabbages. Down there on the left, cabbages. Look at this. There are 544 varieties of cabbages commercially available in 1903. Follow that same line down below. In 1983, there are 28